Welcome to On the Line. I'm Christine Williams. Coming up for discussion on our Viewpoints Hour, a national newspaper headline stating our Prime Minister has told our cities to drop dead in response to a plea for funding. Stay tuned. And these are the issues we're presenting today to our Viewpoints guests for commentary. The Toronto Star front page headline stating, Prime Minister says to cities, drop dead. Following McGuinty's plea for municipal relief, did Canada fail the Canadian murderer slated for execution in the States by not asking for clemency? And the Ontario Ombudsman, Andre Morin, will investigate why a wealthy ex-cop got over $1 million in legal aid to defend himself on a charge of murdering his mistress. Now let's meet our Viewpoints guests. Rabbi Stephen Wise of Halton's only synagogue, and Robert Metz, who is president of the Freedom Party of Ontario. And you, the viewer, we consider you our third guest. Do call in at any time with any of the issues that we're discussing today, and don't be shy. Thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I must say off the top, I had a little bit of fun with this headline with the Toronto Star. Let's show our viewers. It shocked me when I first saw it. Take a look at it. Prime Minister to cities, drop dead. And just look at the expression on our Prime Minister's face. Now, when I first saw that headline when I came to work, the first thing that came into my mind was, what kind of a Prime Minister will tell our municipalities to drop dead? But when I went on to read the same article by the Toronto Star, as it turns out, he didn't use those words. He didn't say to drop dead. There was a meeting with McGuinty that the Prime Minister had, who pleaded for help from the federal government, given the economic boom that we're having. The answer back was basically this: well, we've already transferred some $43 billion to the provinces, and it's up to the provinces to fund the municipalities. I want to hear what the two of you have to say on this, but it sounded a little bit to me, or it reminded me of a scenario that we sometimes see with siblings where one manages their income, perhaps, I don't know, you may not agree with me, I'd love to hear from you, manages their money, does what they need to do, balances a budget, and another sibling perhaps spends the money in a certain way, gets angry when that other sibling seems to be more prosperous. I don't know. Is that the case? Perhaps I'm accusing the municipalities of not handling the money. Maybe it's a little bit of that together with a need, a genuine need. But the issue I have is our Prime Minister did not say to the municipalities flippantly to drop dead. I'm going to start with you, Rabbi. How did you feel about this article?
Well, you're right. The title is very shocking, and I don't think our Prime Minister would ever tell anyone to drop dead, let alone our cities. But as you say, as I read through it, I'm concerned. I live in this area, and I can see that the government has a surplus, and it would be nice if it trickled down to the cities. I know we certainly need it.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Robert?
Well, first of all, speak to the headline. I happen to know that most newspapers, even if you're an editorial writer, you don't pick the headline. The newspaper picks it for you. So sometimes I can't imagine anybody being covered in a story getting an accurate headline if an editorial writer doesn't. But I think Harper is generally acknowledging the fact that the federal government doesn't have the proper constitutional jurisdiction to fund provincial municipalities in a direct way. The federal government just doesn't have that jurisdiction. Municipalities are definitely creatures of the province. They're created under the Municipalities Act of Ontario, and that's basically a provincial creature. So to get the federal government involved with the provinces on that level, I think is a mistake, and I think it's a mistake we've been making in this country for quite a while, is one level of government mandating certain programs that other levels of government are responsible for, or other levels of government starting programs that they can't pay for and they look to other sources. I think that's just a formula for destruction.
Now here's another headline that we also grabbed a hold of, in fact, today, and it's a lesser one. It's a small commentary, and it's entitled, Harper to Cities, Grow Up. Quite a different response that we see there. If we can get that article up. There we go, grow up. Very different wording, but I want to go back to this whole issue about funding the cities, because when the articles came out, it was plastered across the headlines everywhere that about our government, Flaherty, slashing from the point of view of the GST. And let's face it, that was an election promise. But immediately the criticism followed. And I see this article as a bit of a continuation of that. The criticism followed. How could a government, in its prosperity, start slashing taxes, although it was an election promise, given the kinds of need that we do see in our municipalities? Now, I'm going to say money could always be managed better, we know this, but we do have a need when it comes to community-based issues of funding, social issues. There has been a lot of criticism involving education. Many moms would like to see, particularly for certain groups, better education for their preschool children. A lot of money needed. Poverty issues. How do you feel about this?
Right. I mean, certainly if the money can't trickle down from the federal government to the cities, then maybe they could take over some of some of the issues that affect the whole country, like a national preschool plan that the federal government could fund, or a national poverty plan. And so that way they wouldn't be transferring money to a municipality, but like you said, be able to handle some of the crisis that we're facing.
Now, Robert, how do you feel about the government when it comes to handling these issues with community, with the poverty issues?
Well, that's a general
What's your
question.
opinion
I
on
think
this? Yes.
in terms of the federal government, I think, again, it's jurisdictional. But look at the municipalities. In our city, where I come from, the City of London, Ontario, the city municipality, the city councillors want to spend in excess of $50 to $100 million on a new arts entertainment center. Meanwhile, you know what just happened in London last week? We have a huge sinkhole at the corner of Dundas and Wellington, the main intersection of the city. And it's going to be closed for another month, has been closed for 3 weeks already. This morning as I left, another section of road collapsed somewhere else, creating another water main break. And this is something that I, locally in London, have been complaining about for 20 years. Infrastructure. It's just not a sexy issue. It doesn't get people elected. But here you have your municipalities that refuse to fund their own. We have politicians on our municipal council running to Harper as well. Please fund our municipality. We want money from the others. And I quite frankly have to ask why someone in Vancouver should be subsidizing someone in Toronto, why someone in Toronto should be subsidizing someone in Vancouver. It's all going back and forth. Now, what's the connection there? It's a middleman. Do we need that middleman, or should we just keep our money in our own communities, which is why we live there, because one community should have an advantage or a disadvantage or something different about it, and why our cities all look the same from coast to coast. If I go downtown Vancouver, it doesn't look any different than London, Ontario on a main street, and it's because it's all funded the same.
You bring up some good points, but I'm going to be asking you after we get to our caller there that I'm going to be asking the two of you the question whether you think the government is being fair to the poor overall, because there's this belief that we see these days in the headlines that the government does not have enough concern when it comes to issues involving the poor. We're going to go now to Brian on line 7. Hello, Brian. You're on the line.
Hi.
Hello, Brian.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. I'm so tired of Canadians just saying we're going to take it when, you go back to Mulroney and Don Blancarn brought in the GST and said, it's a necessary step to pay, we all got to pay this down. And now there's literally billions of dollars every year in excess, and none of us get a tax break. In fact, I live in Mississauga, and Hazel goes and raises our tax rate. People think she's great, but we're the highest tax city in North America. It's absolutely ridiculous. We're just working people. We can't much take it anymore, yet we don't have any, like monk centers for tax people where we can get together and, we get paid to kind of get the message out to the media that it's time to stop this. The people have had it,
So, Brian, you obviously appreciate the cut to that GST. Brian, thanks for calling in. We're going to go for a break, and we're going to continue talking about this issue after the break. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. We're continuing for now to talk about the issue where the Prime Minister supposedly, according to the Toronto Star, which he did not, says to cities, drop dead. I wanted to widen this a bit when you look at the attitude that you're seeing these papers portray about the government as a whole, that it's not poor friendly. There's a lot of need in the communities. Once again, I do not want to forget to mention that $43 billion were transferred to the provinces for this very issue, to be able to deal with the provincial issues, which also contains part of passing down to the municipalities. And another article that I have here where it says, Harper says to cities, grow up instead of the drop dead, which is more accurate. $14 billion more than 4 years ago when you look at that $43 billion that was transferred to the provinces. But now it was, okay, we got that aside. When you look at some of these articles that portrays our government to be very, perhaps, unfriendly to the poor, what is your analysis of this? I'm going to start with you on this one, Robert.
I don't think it's about being unfriendly to the poor. What they mean by that is we don't see the government spending more money, which is not necessarily friendly to the poor.
Which is not really true either, because we cannot forget that $43 billion indeed was transferred to the provinces.
Sure, but it's never enough. Because
it'll never be enough,
right.
Now would it? And that's a key issue.
That's the key. If you make need your standard, then you have an unlimited demand, which is a problem with all of our social systems. And it's not so much what we do to help the poor. I'm in favor of anything. It's how you get the money to help the poor. Do you get the money voluntarily from people by asking them for it, or do you fund it through
government? Through
government, which is not voluntary. And then what you do is you put a noose around the neck of your citizens, because in order to keep my home, it depends on how well other people are doing in society. If they're not doing well, I'm going to lose my home. And that's the way, rent right now, or rather property taxes now are basically becoming a rent even after you've paid your home off.
Oh, that's true, that's true.
And so if you don't pay that property tax in 3 years in most municipalities, the city can act and take your home away, which means it is not your home. You only hold a title to it, the city can take it away from you, which is, again, coming back to the funding issue. We shouldn't be using property taxes to fund municipalities. They should be part of a consumption tax, which is what a lot of people hate. They hate sales taxes and consumption taxes and licenses and filing and all that kind of thing. But we shouldn't have property taxes. That's the most fundamental piece of security anyone can have, rich or poor. And if you cut back on what I call the punitive taxes, which are property and income, you're going to do a lot more good for the whole base of people.
Okay, at the end of the day, though, Robert, when you look at a fixed amount of dollars that's yielded through taxation, under the method that you're proposing, would you expect to end up with the same amount at the end of the day or much less? From the point of view of the government, yes, when you're looking at a consumption tax.
Depends on what they decide. Depends entirely on what they decide. I'm just saying that the method of payment should be something different. Now, if you want to get into the morality of what we spend the money on, I think municipalities should be limited to those basic essential services, the infrastructure of the corporation, which would be your sewers and all that, and
so the poor should be left to the goodwill of the people.
The governments can help if they have raised the money and have enough money, but they don't institute a program specifically for that, because it becomes permanent forever and will grow forever and will never meet a need. It creates one, in fact.
Rabbi Wise?
Well, I was living in the United States for the past 10 years, and I think the poverty issues in the States reflect that attitude where, it's up to people to take care of other people and the government shouldn't have a hand in it. And so what I love about being a Canadian citizen is that I know that my government will take care of those who are less fortunate. And, we're talking about poor or single moms. It's not like these people can simply find the money. It's part of our social contract that was established in the 1960s, that we are a country that takes care of each other. And I know you're not saying that we don't take care of each other, but I still think that the government, it's part of their responsibility to help people, on the bottom, and help them get on their feet again.
I think the question is always how much, though? How much? Do you see our government as being unfriendly toward the poor?
I don't think they're unfriendly to the poor. In each government, a Stephen Harper government might be different than a Mulroney government, liberal, conservative, NDP. Ultimately, there's a Canadian idea that we help people, and that's what our government should stand for, no matter who's in power. And it seems to be a degree of how much money is coming depending on who the Prime Minister is at the time.
Well, that's a very interesting point of view as well. I'm going to move on to our other subject matter now, because The government's also been taking it in the chin on this issue as well. And the title for this one is Killer Kicked to the Curb by Canada. Here we see Ron Smith. And this man, basically, convicted. The interesting part is, he's supposed to face the death penalty in Montana. Canada traditionally has asked for clemency when it comes to these death sentences, because as a country we don't believe in the death penalty. But then comes the issue, you're looking at another country, you're looking at a man here that shot 2 people dead, 2 people that were kind enough to pick him up as a hitchhiker. He shot them dead. One was 20, one was 22. And at the time he did this, he was given an option at that time to either face his consecutive sentencing and be transferred over to Canada, or go for the death penalty. Well, his lawyers argued that he was depressed at the time, so he decided to say, go for the death penalty. So it's important to clarify something here. He was given an option at one point. But now comes a point where the issue is Canada decides not to intervene in this country's system here. He was tried, given the death sentence, and it seems like it's going to go ahead. Well, according to this article, Killer has been kicked to the curb by Canada. That's how he feels. Not long after that, some talk shows came out with the question, perhaps our Prime Minister is headed toward bringing back the death penalty here in Canada. So it got a little bit widened to that. But let's do this as a two-parter. In terms of Canada's decision not to get involved in what the U.S. does with its criminals, although he is Canadian, I'd love to hear what the two of you feel about that. Do you agree with the Harper government for doing this, or don't you agree? Robert, what do you say?
Well, you know, I've actually been involved in a similar case that involves Canada-United States relationships on this count. Certainly this individual that we're speaking of deserves no mercy in the sense of he wasn't kind to his victim. He doesn't seem to be arguing the fact that he did what he did. I think certainly Canada should still make an attempt, or at least a feigned one, at least to send a message where we stand on the issue of capital punishment. I think on one hand, Harper was suggesting if we bring this person back, he may present a future danger to Canadians, which to me is a statement more about the Canadian justice system than it is about anything happening in the U.S. Also, we have a case pending here in Canada, not related to this one, but if you want to talk about U.S.-Canada relations, a friend of mine who I happen to know, named Mark Emery, is about to be extradited to the United States for selling pot seeds, where he can face the death penalty or life imprisonment for something we don't even lock him up for up here. So, and the Americans are saying that he broke their law when he never once stepped on their territory, and they're coming to get him, and we're going to hand him over. So did you break an American law yesterday? You know, they can come over into our country to get you. This is how confused I think the jurisdictions between the two countries are becoming.
But we're discussing this issue here.
Yes.
Is it unfair, according to what the headlines are saying, that we're deciding not to seek clemency? Is that a troubling pattern to you, that perhaps it signifies that Canada is going to bring back the death penalty? We're going to continue after this break. Stay tuned. And when Hello again, and welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. We're continuing to talk about our articles, and the one that we're talking about now has to do with, well, it's related to the death penalty. Our lines are open. Do join us at any time. Now, I'm going to ask you your opinion when it comes to this whole issue of seeking clemency, first of all, because I'd love to touch on this whole issue of the death penalty again, of course, but what do you think about it?
I'm very disappointed in our Prime Minister. I think that it would not take much to ask for clemency. In Canada, we don't have the death penalty. We feel very strongly against the death penalty.
Yes.
So he should seek justice for this man. Now, I'm not saying what he did was right, and he should rot in prison for the rest of his life in Montana or wherever it is, but I think Stephen Harper should call and say, we do not kill people here in Canada for their crimes. We cannot, you should not impose the death penalty on a Canadian citizen. If he was in Afghanistan and they said we're going to cut off his arm for stealing, I would hope for that maybe we would also say something. I mean, yes, you have to respond, you have to live by the rules of law in the country you're in. But if the punishment is torture or death or beyond what we think is reasonable, then I think our government should have a say in it.
Should have asked for the clemency. But did you really see this as perhaps an opening for our government drifting back into the whole debate about the death penalty? Would you go over and make that assumption that because we chose, well, not we, well, Canada, the government representing us, so to speak, because the choice was made not to seek clemency over there, that necessarily automatically means, well, perhaps it could be a clue that we're going to be bringing back the death penalty here?
Well, our country seems to be drifting a little bit right-wing, and it wouldn't surprise me if the next time this case came up again, the government suggested that, you know, maybe that is an appropriate punishment for that individual. I mean, that's kind of what they're saying. If they're not saying it's wrong, then they're saying it's right.
But how about the argument, look, this is a man that lives in the U.S., committed crimes against U.S. citizens, basically says he wanted to see what it felt like to kill a human, lived there, went through that system, was given the opportunity then to come back here, chose not to, chose to carry out a part of a sentence there and then face a death penalty.
Well, we generally assume that anyone who gets a death penalty has done something terrible.
Well, of course,
okay?
of course, obviously.
So to focus on
but
the
he lived
person,
there.
the nature.
This is
yes.
another nation
Understood.
that you're basically.
And he also had a choice at some point during his procedure to come to Canada. And having refused that and taking his chances, that might be the reason. I don't know the fundamental reason that the Harper government laid off. Until we see a pattern, I don't think we can say for sure that it's a sign of anything, but it's the first glimmer. And if it happens again and the next time there wasn't that option in place, well, maybe we can see a change.
So you believe that whoever's living in another country, let's say you're living in Saudi Arabia, you commit some heinous crime over there, you end up in a jail over there, which is not like jails over here, that perhaps we should be intervening, because if you really were to dig up the honest story when it comes to how many Canadians are in jails globally, whether it be a Russian jail, Saudi Arabia, Syrian jail. I mean, we're talking about the U.S. jails here, but look, there are a lot of other places that I'm sure Canadians have committed crimes.
And
do you think that for every one of them, Canada should get involved and ask for them to be extradited here?
No.
That's your belief?
No. We're only talking about very serious cases where they're going to either torture someone or execute them, because there's no going back if you made a mistake. There's no going back to renegotiate errors. You know, it's funny when people were asked about the death penalty, and it was you asked them, if you use the word capital punishment, you get a higher rate of people saying they support it. Actually say death penalty, it goes down, and yet some people think the two are the same. I think life should mean life in serious cases, because that will always give you the option, if you made an error, to let out an innocent person, which, by the way, is a huge issue in the prison system. I think we don't talk about that very much. I have seen reports from groups like Amnesty International and others who have reported, never mind the third world countries, but even in Western nations, that up to 25 to 30% of people in jails are there who shouldn't be there.
Oh, that's another issue that I couldn't agree with you more. We need to look at this.
That's a very key reason not to support the death penalty. It's not out of any mercy in the sense of for the evil that a person has done to someone else. It's got nothing to do with that. It's a secondary consideration. The act of self-defense has already taken place. If someone's coming at you and you are defending yourself, then you quote, don't have a right to kill, but it's justified, as we say, if you did it. That act has passed when you're dealing with justice and principles of justice. You're no longer in a defensive situation. You might be in a retaliatory situation, but certainly what you have to do is bring justice. And I think that's a principle that works on an individual basis and on a national basis if you're dealing with countries.
Let's go now to Peter on line 4. Hello, Peter. You're on the line.
Yes, hi. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Yes, I'd just like to say that the fact that Canada does not have a death penalty does not preclude other nations that are sovereign for enforcing their law.
No,
Well, Peter, thanks for that short, sweet statement there, because I know one person agrees with you here for sure in this article that I have here. Okay, the headline reads, "Let Killer Face Music in U.S. Canadian government should not ask for clemency," by Peter Worthington of the Toronto Sun. He starts by saying, what on earth is all the fuss about? Now, basically what he says in this article here is you're looking at a democratic nation that's sovereign in itself, a crime is committed, and basically Peter goes along the same line of this argument that the two of them are basically one and the same. You've got a country, you've got the death penalty, the guy does the crime over there, and that's their law. He goes through the system, and that's how it's seen. Now, I know if you're in a country where, and again, it comes down to where you draw the line in terms of your own moral or ethical sense. You've got a prisoner, for instance, in jail somewhere where they're going to be sat down, and every finger's going to be cut off one by one. They're going to be tortured. Come on. Are you going to be so void of balance that you cannot separate that from a lethal injection? I mean seriously here. I know that there are issues regarding when Canada intervenes. I know that we don't support the death penalty, but to compare whether a person is being tortured in jail to our neighbor, the U.S., that happens to implement the death penalty, not in every area. Do you make that comparison? Yeah, exactly, exactly.
But again, I don't think anyone's encroaching on anyone's jurisdiction per se. We have agreements with the United States. We have long-standing customs and practices between us. This just happens to be one of them. I don't think that anyone's really seriously expecting the U.S. to say, "Oh yeah, here you can have all your murderers back."
And by the way, that doesn't always happen because, as Peter Worthington pointed out, and in 1999, Texas refused to grant that clemency to a man that was actually
at least we made
had
the
committed
effort.
a
We
crime.
made a statement.
You think the
Death
effort should be
trumps
made?
everything else. I mean, if they're going to
Yes,
put
it
someone
does.
to death, that is when we step in.
And the argument about the death penalty
We're
will
not going to go
always
to war,
be.
but we're going to make a statement, and we're going to exercise whatever diplomatic authority we have. But
Oh,
beyond
of
that, you
course,
can't do
of
much.
course, of course. But the argument about the death penalty is not something that will simply be brushed under the carpet, because there's lots of division, even here in Canada, as to whether the death penalty should be a part of our justice system or whether it shouldn't. But what I find interesting is the way it was taken in this context to be, well, the next step is that Stephen Harper perhaps is going to bring back the death penalty. Frankly,
Well,
I
maybe
can't
we
see our
should have a
country
talk with
agreeing.
Stephen Truscott
I
about
can't see
that
our
one.
country agreeing
Never
with it
mind Stephen
necessarily.
Harper. Sorry,
And
Stephen.
I just think it was an interesting, it was an interesting point of view to take something like this and then all of a sudden make it another one. Anyway, let's go to Justin before we go to a break on line 7. Hello, Justin. You're on the line.
How you doing? Hi.
Fine, thank you.
I just wanted to say that it's quite incredible that topics like getting somebody who's a criminal out of America come up when things like Darfur or even more recently Somalia are not even really paid attention to.
You know what, Justin? I agree with you. No argument from me. We're going to go for a break. We'll return after this. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. The third issue we're talking about, take a look at the headline. Ombudsman to probe murderers' legal aid. Now, this particular story, it's got a lot embedded in it, simply because here you have a particular case of an ex-cop by the name of Richard Wills. This man is described in this article as being a wealthy ex-cop, yet how did he manage to get $1 million from legal aid? There's a loophole in our system, it would seem, and to me this article opens up a wider topic of accountability when it comes to government funds. Now, all of our topics today related to the government in some way or another, but in terms of the role of the government, managing funds, to me this is a classic example. How do you get a guy like this that apparently sold 6 of several properties that he has, 6 of them was identified in the article, and still described as wealthy, has a pension going on of something like $1,900 a month. That's what he finally agreed on, closed on with whatever force he was on. And still, $1 million in legal aid. And from what I understand about this fellow here, he was not one of those easy people to go through the system. He was a nightmare through the court system. Again, he goes through, and his charge was murdering his mistress. Comments about this, the justice of this? Let's start with you.
Well, I don't know how he got the money in the first place.
But isn't that scary, that problem? How did he get the money in the first place?
There might be a reason. He did apparently sell all his assets, so is that because of his court case? I'm assuming it is. He was unfortunately found guilty. I wonder if we'd be having the same conversation if he was found innocent.
That's a good point, yes.
Or whether it even matters, because, okay, he got $1 million here. Was it money well spent? At least we found out that he was guilty, and there's no more doubt about it because he had a good defense. Can't argue that he didn't have a good defense. So there's so many questions. Is it a special case? Is it because he was an ex-police officer that someone had an interest in protecting essentially the reputation of an agent of government of some sort, if you want, in the longer run? And the other thing is, of course, who would get stuck with the tab if it wasn't the taxpayer? Who else would be left if he went into his court case? It seems to tell me as well that we have very expensive lawyers in our court system.
We do.
And maybe that's the issue we should be talking about. But that someone could even spend $1 million in excess of selling all of their other assets. What lawyer?
One person here.
What lawyers are taking all this money in, and where is that money possibly going? I can't imagine how much research you can possibly do, how many detectives you could hire, how many private investigators or whatever. Where do you spend $1 million?
Well, I interviewed the dear Philip Slayton on his book called Lawyers Gone Bad. I know there was an article written in Maclean's that talked about lawyers are rats. And I also realized that there was a warning issued by a very prominent individual with the Bar Association that warned, actually, that lawyers had better be careful, because what's happening is, given the rates that these people charge, they could be doing themselves out of a job, because there is a pattern that's going on now that people are more and more choosing to represent themselves in court because they just simply cannot afford to pay a lawyer. But I've also known many cases of people who applied to legal aid or who desperately needed it and couldn't get legal aid. But here you have this obnoxious ex-cop, and if you were following any of the articles, he was horrible there. And $1 million went into this guy, as well as you said, selling all this property. What does that tell you as to how this happened? Opinions?
It's clear that we need some sort of safeguards, maybe a limit on how much money you can get through legal aid. When they look at your background, it can't just be, well, I have no money right now, but trace back a year or two, see how much property or how much money you had beforehand, and assess it that way. I mean, I appreciate legal aid. I think, especially for refugees,
it's needed, but who gets it? Who should be getting legal aid is the question. Let's go now to Naila on line 7. Hello, Naila. You're on the line.
Hi. My question was, how are government of Ontario conducting their money? I was a very well manager of this here in Ontario. I've been working, and there has been circumstances that I ended up on welfare because I was sick and my benefits are not paying, and they are paying $500 to me. How can they justify this thing? And I want to go back to my work because as soon as I'm recovered, both of my shoulder muscles are torn, and I am not supposed to do anything, because if I'll do something, then I will hurt myself more. And how can I live with $548? My rent, if they want me to leave my rental apartment, how soon can I go out and find a rental apartment?
Concerns about all the government funding. You see, that's a big one. I think when you look at an article like this, it gets people's blood boiling, because there are a lot of people out there who have needed legal aid, justifiably so. And here you see a case of a fellow charged with murdering his mistress, and he gets $1 million. Where did that money go? Now, our Ombudsman has seen the case as something serious enough to investigate it. Any additions to this?
Go ahead.
No, I agree with that.
Well, I was just going to say, with respect to the one big pot of government money we have that goes to all these different causes, that's part of the problem. There are people waiting in hospitals for cancer operations and treatments. I mean, you could.
What could $1 million do?
How many levels of need can you put that, put someone right at the top? Ever hear that joke by George Carlin? Who's the last guy on earth? Who's the guy who's worst off?
Well, it brings up the whole issue of priority, which we need to discuss more. Before we go for a break, let's go now to Ross on line 4. Hello, Ross. You're on the line.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ross.
I used to practice law in Ontario and used to take legal aid certificates. And I saw firsthand how the clients, not the lawyers, abused the system. I wrote copious letters to the system exposing these individuals, and 100% of the time, the system ignored my correspondence.
Now, Ross, you bring up an interesting point, but I'm very curious, given what you're saying you did in the system, how you feel about this ex-cop that got $1 million from legal aid. Do you have an opinion about this case?
Well, I'm incensed that he got that
You
kind
think it's
of
an abuse of the system?
Well, it's horrific that he got that he knows as a policeman or an ex-policeman how to manipulate the system. And he did it very well.
Maybe that's the answer. We're going to go for a break now. We'll continue after this. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. We're talking about the topic of legal aid. In fact, it's expanding to that topic overall because it's based on the headline about our ombudsman to probe murderers' legal aid. The ex-cop, there you go, there's the headline. There you have the ex-cop that charges of murdering his mistress, and he's described as wealthy, sells 6 properties, obviously has a lot of money, yet $1 million in legal aid. Let's go now to Grace on line 1. Hello, Grace, you're on the line. Whoops, looks like Grace hung up. Once again, you're looking at an issue perhaps of priority here, priority. And you mentioned something very interesting earlier, Rabbi, about maybe there needs to be some kind of a cutoff when it comes to legal aid. Maybe this needs to be looked at stricter. But I know that there are people out there who have applied to legal aid, have gone through the system, and perhaps you were rejected. But here now we have a murderer here that had the money. And for some reason, he managed to, maybe that was it. Our last caller that said, well, he was an ex-cop. He knew how to play the system. Maybe that was a case of it.
I think there's a lot of truth to that, too. I'm not too sure whether we're talking about priorities as much. Maybe we should be talking a little bit about process.
Process, definitely.
Because when I think of legal aid, just very generically, I don't understand the intricate legal workings of it. As the one caller suggested, maybe this person did know all the ins and outs, and that's why he got so much. But generally, the idea, as I understand it, is to provide for those people some assurance that they will get justice in our so-called justice system if they don't have money that is necessary to access that justice system. So it strikes me that you can meet that requirement without just handing them money. You can make money available, make certain that they do whatever they can to pay as much of it back as possible, perhaps even forgive it at a certain point if after the process you decide this person's really, in a tough spot. I think there should be maybe a multi-layered process and not just hand it all over at the beginning and forget about it, if that's what's going on now. But
something tells me that's not what's going on, based on what I've known, and that's what makes this case so surprising, enough to get our ombudsman involved to investigate how this guy ended up with $1 million.
If you or I were charged for murder out of the blue, wouldn't the state appoint someone for us if we didn't have money for a lawyer? Wouldn't that be almost an automatic thing? Is that separate from legal aid per se?
Now, for what I'm understanding, a person's definitely, it would seem like it's their due. In terms of a citizen in society, you need somebody to defend you, you get what you get. But you see, that's where I have the question. A lot of people have been settled with they get what they get.
Right.
But this fellow was a pain during that whole process. $1 million, I think he got beyond, and I think that's what's raising the eyebrows. I mean, Andre Moret chooses his cases to investigate. Why is it that this guy managed to squeeze that much money out of the system at the expense, perhaps, of other people who may have been, let's say, in more need? And still.
And I still have to ask, would they still be doing that if he had been found innocent? You see, that to me, that's part of the process almost. Okay, if he was found innocent, maybe we'd be looking at this a little bit differently. If he were found, because then otherwise we'd have been putting an innocent man in jail, wouldn't we?
Well, again, what you're saying there raises a very interesting question. The emotion that comes out of that sentence appeals to everybody's sense of justice, which is not without merit. I would agree. We would perhaps see it differently if he was found innocent. But the point of the matter is, here is the reality. This guy found guilty, an ex-cop, $1 million gone, found guilty, sells 6 of his properties, described as wealthy, and yet it was seen as, and is seen as, a complete waste of money. Wasted on perhaps a guilty person. Maybe that's part of it.
That's what I think.
And as you mentioned before, I mean, what about the law firm that accepts $1 million from the government, on behalf of this individual? I mean, is there any kind of checkup on that? I mean,
I don't think there's any checkup on that.
Yeah, is there any conscience there of how much money it costs to do this case?
I wonder if they give money back refunds for failed cases.
Right.
I don't think it works that way, unfortunately.
No, it definitely doesn't work that way. We're going to go for a break. We'll return after this. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. We're talking about the justice of legal aid, if you want to put it that way. Something very interesting you pointed out during the break, Robert, and it had to do with our system as it is, the legal system, versus justice.
Yes, distinguishing between law and justice. And so much of, there's a saying among a lot of lawyers I know that is once you're in the courtroom, you've already lost.
Wow.
After that, you're just cutting your losses on each side of the game, because that means you haven't resolved whatever your dispute is successfully. Of course, in a criminal case like this, it's a little bit different. But nevertheless, that what we see in a trend, and I've heard a lot of lawyers comment on this, is a lot of law and very little justice. And that the fundamental principles of justice, which are more philosophical than anything else, have sort of been put by the wayside. And as you were saying, it's become a game of law. Who's got the smarts? Who can pull out that latest precedent for the judge to impress him the most? And so that's probably part of what caused this huge bill here, because I think someone was shopping for quality defense lawyers.
He was definitely, and that's a point I think we need to harp on for a while here. He was shopping for quality defense. And in fact, if you go back to previous articles, many lawyers were fired in the process. As I mentioned before, this man was a nightmare in the system. And you brought out earlier on in the program, well, isn't it our right, if you get charged with something, that you'll be given somebody?
Some kind of
well, yes,
basic
but this
defense.
man was choosy, and it came on taxpayers' back.
Right, he should have to, if he's represented as the province appoints someone, that's going to be your lawyer, and you don't have a right to fire that person, especially if you're going with legal aid. I mean, there is a system in place, and you have to live by the rules. You committed the crime, you have to live by the rules.
And being in Canada, he's not facing a death penalty.
Well, if you want to look at it on the
If you
bright
want to
side.
go back to the first subject, but one assumes he's going to get out at some point in time again, or our whole prison system is a whole other issue in terms of what people do in prison, if they could be made a little bit more productive somehow. But ideally, it would be nice if some of that money could be paid back, even if it was in the long run, if not tomorrow or even in 10 years, but somehow. And again, I think that's part of a long-term process that should be developed. I see all kinds of problems with legal aid. It just sounds like there's a fund there, everybody uses it until it's exhausted, and then it's not there anymore.
Well, one thing the article does point out, too, is that precise, what you said there, what will be done as a result, because the Ombudsman's investigation is going to include, which is traditional, a set of recommendations. And maybe this opens the door to a bit of an overhaul in our system, because there seems to be a mysticism as to what goes on behind closed doors when it comes to our legal system, because here we are talking about this. You've known lawyers, I've talked to lawyers, I've interviewed Philip Slayton, and still it seems to be a veil or a secrecy. Or perhaps, if you want to say, maybe there isn't a set bunch of rules in place that will guarantee that justice prevails. And I think that's the gripe that we see a lot of people having about our legal system, that is it just? Are people really getting the benefit of what they deserve, or perhaps what they're entitled to? Because here we see, which seems to be like a real travesty of justice. It's sad.
I thought you were going to say something there.
No, I'm waiting to hear what you guys have to reply. Are you...
I agree with your overall impressions there. I just think that, again, we don't have a perfect system. We can set for an ideal. I think ideal is the best you go for. And you maybe have some level of perfection that you can judge by a standard, and you're shooting for that perfection all the time. But it's never going to be perfect. I don't think people are perfect. I think that's part of the reason we have a justice system. I think that's part of the reason we shouldn't have a death penalty, because the people who are making the decisions are every bit as imperfect as often the people who are on the receiving end of the punishment, so to speak. And quite often, what's very frightening to me in some court cases, I don't know about this one specifically, but you talk about what evidence is permitted and what isn't permitted, and quite often you see evidence that you think is very pertinent to an issue, almost fundamental to it, and it's not allowed in the courtroom. So, then you start wondering, now that's not justice anymore. That's when they're playing the legal game.
Games. But you see, as far as I know, too, there are a lot of twists and turns in the legal system, and unless you have a sharp eye...
And deal making.
and deal making.
Yeah, because that goes on because most people don't admit to their guilt
Are you,
right off.
are you talking about any chance about the deal with the devil? Is that what
Well,
you're thinking about here?
any kind of deal, yeah, that will get them
Plea
the
bargaining.
convictions they want, which is another reason why so many, I think, there's a high percentage of innocent people behind bars and in jails because of the way the system works sometimes. It's not perfect, and every jurisdiction's a little bit different, whether you're talking provincial, state, federal, in each of the countries. So it's far from perfect, but I think overall we need to be guided by fundamental principles of justice, again as an ideal, and try to make our laws somehow be consistent with those principles, rather than veering off in the opposite direction as far away
That's
from
for
those
sure.
justice principles.
Certainly, a lot
as
of
we
work
can.
needs to be done in our system. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you both so much for joining
Thank you.
me. See you again next time. I'm Christine Williams, and from all of us, thank you for watching.